All right, good.
All right, great. So welcome to this biweekly SIG cloud provider meeting, everybody. It looks like we have a pretty light agenda today, but if you have any additional items that you'd like to add, please feel free to drop them into the Google Doc, and also put your name down if you're attending. It doesn't look like we have anybody new this week, unless there's someone new over at the Google offices. But if you are new, welcome. So we're going to have Andrew kick off the agenda with deciding on the 1.13 milestones, particularly should the cloud provider interface stay in beta or should it go GA?
Yeah, so in the last meeting, it was brought up that we should have a decision for what features we want to move forward for 1.13. And the cloud provider interface is kind of like the API that our SIG owns. And yeah, pretty much we need to decide soon if we want to push that forward for GA in coming up in 1.13. And so from my opinion, at least, is that, and this other people had the same opinion last week, was that we should probably play it safe given that this release is going to be shorter than other releases. And with KubeCon coming up, I think we should just play it safe and have the cloud provider interface as beta for 1.13. But yeah, I wanted to kind of open up for discussion and see if anyone thinks that we should push forward for GA otherwise.
I think that makes sense. I guess the question is do we see, do we anticipate any major changes coming into the API or any new additions that are coming into it?
So I was hoping to kind of take KubeCon as a chance for us to kind of reevaluate if we do want to make any kind of breaking changes, or kind of like a final call for breaking changes we might want to make to the interface. And if we want to do that, then we of course have to stay beta up for 1.13. And then
Seattle or China?
Yes, Seattle.
Yeah, I would like to suggest that we get really crisp about what GA means, what the requirements are. We talked earlier about having some tests that we would add later. I don't know that any effort has been put into that, but planning really well and getting early in the Q1 1.14 timeframe and just sticking the landing rather than being unsure in 1.13, I think is a better plan. So I guess what I'm saying is I think we should not remove the urgency, but we should plan for it to be in 1.14 and be really well done. How does that sound?
I think that sounds good. So when we talk about tests, were we thinking like general behavior tests that would enforce consistency across the cloud providers themselves, or unit tests that somehow just check basic behavior of the interface?
I think this is part of the conversation we need to have. I don't know that we're going to come to that. I guess we have time today. We might as well start the conversation, but my intention wasn't to come to conclusion on that today. It was mostly to say we need some statement about the testing strategy and why we feel comfortable with it. If that includes a mock cloud provider or a dev null cloud provider or not, I don't know. But I think we've been pretty hand wavy about the requirements of that in the past. And I think if we're considering a GA, that exercise will help discover if there's any gaps or near-term evolution of the API. I don't think we have to imagine all the cases that could ever exist ever, but I think we should have clarity that we're not going to make a breaking change to the API in the first couple of releases after it goes GA.
Well, if I can add to that, I also think we should think about this in regards to conformance. I'm fairly sure that there are APIs which technically are implemented, but in fact are no-ops on a good number of the cloud providers. And so we should be very clear which of the cloud provider APIs are required to be fully implemented and which are allowed to be no-ops.
Yeah, yeah. I was about to mention the same thing too, especially there have been one of the reasons that this group was founded was an issue from, I don't know, a year and a half ago, where every cloud treats nodes a little bit differently. And I think it makes sense in the context of this provider to actually, where we can, establish consistent behavior across the providers, and testing is the best way to do that.
But also, I think we need to be, I mean, I think it may be okay to have certain of the APIs listed as, I don't know, optional is probably the wrong word, but for lack of a better one, optional. So for instance, I think there's a sort of a push certificate method somewhere in the cloud provider interface, and I'm fairly sure that Google is the only one who implements it. And maybe that's okay, but I think, for purposes of the other SIGs and anyone who wants to rely on some of these behaviors, we need to be very clear on which ones are required to be fully implemented by the cloud provider and which ones are nice to have.
And testing can even be used to enforce some of this. Like if something isn't implemented, then there should be a consistent way that the user is informed that it's not implemented, and that can be tested for, right? If you don't get the proper response back, another option would be that you get a standard error back.
Yeah, I agree.
Are we making the cloud provider interface that to me is a Go interface, and to date we haven't made any Go interfaces stable ? Whereas what we have done is we've said that, like a Kubernetes cluster running with this configuration is conformant or does work, which do make sense. Like in theory, someone could write a cloud controller manager in Java, which obviously would not use the same interface, but would still be conformant or could still be conformant.
I think that's true, but I guess I'm viewing it from the other direction. I'm thinking of, for someone who's modifying service controller or route controller, they are dependent on behavior of the cloud provider interface. And we are trying to get to a world where that's a black box to them. And I think if we're saying that that's a black box, that they should be able to depend on the behavior, then we need to be very clear on what behavior they can depend on when they're modifying the service controller.
And I think, but I think this is why a lot of people are confused, because when they think about APIs, they're thinking about, core v1, apps v1, whatever. And so like taking that as an example, like let's say we add, a context parameter to a method in the cloud provider interface, which is breaking because whoever vendors it next has to update that method signature. Like, we should define if we consider that breaking, or if we just define or we consider it something else, right? So like, I feel like the current features issue we have, that's kind of the generic support out of tree providers. Maybe it's time we break that out into specifically the interface and the out of tree component, or the cloud controller manager, which includes all the component flags and whatever.
Yes, the longer term strategy or goal should be to define the behavior, to make cloud providers pluggable.
Yeah.
And we started in a weird spot, so we didn't start with that objective. But that, if we approach this problem today, we would have a CXI type name and go in that direction, like CSI or CNI or whatever, CCPI maybe. I don't know. But I think we need to be clear about this strategy before we consider it GA, and I think that's the right direction the right order of steps to pursue is to come up with that strategy and then demonstrate that what we have meets those criteria, and therefore it is reasonable to be GA. Otherwise, we're just begging the question when that PR goes in.
This sounds like an action item calling for a cap.
Or if not a cap, opening new issues in the features repo or enhancements repo now.
Enhancements, yeah. Be careful. Not too forward-looking terminology.
Yeah. So for action item, how do we feel if I can volunteer unless anyone else wants to do this, but I can kind of break down all the enhancements we have going forward into like more issues that have like more intent and is more specific about requirements. And then in the next SIG meeting, we can have a discussion about if we're okay with that going forward into 114. And the way I break it down is likely a separate enhancement issue just for the interface, and which kind of defines like behaviors, what we consider breaking, all that. And then we can have a separate one for the component flags and essentially like how to run Cloud Controller Manager.
Yeah, but I think that, yeah, that sounds right to me. But I think, yeah, we've got to view that interface as a pluggable system, right?
Yeah.
Should be, but if you adhere to whatever we say you need to do, you should be able to plug. You should, as a new cloud provider, be able to write your implementation of the interface, adhere to what we've told you to do, and everything should work.
I do. We should also be crystal clear on what we're getting by making it stable versus just saying we promise not to break it lightly. Like, you know, in the past we've had to change the API. I think there was a great refactor that went on, I think, for OpenStack. I don't remember who did that, probably someone here, but like change it to take nodes, which was really, actually was very beneficial across the board. I think we've certainly had to make changes to, like, in the early days, to change the behavior that was slightly different on AWS and GCP. We might find another cloud provider that has a similar difference. As long as I think we should be able to make those changes, as long as we don't just make them because we feel like it. Like, I don't think we should swap two fields around because we decided alphabetical order is better today.
Right. Yeah. The way OpenStack has managed some of these changes that have been going in is we just pin our releases to the Kubernetes release. And so if you want, so we don't guarantee that the head of our branch will work with, say, 112 now. You know, we've already pinned it to 113 alpha. So.
Okay, so but we're all in agreement about the staying beta though, right?
We're in agreement about not calling it GA.
Okay.
Until we're clear on what that means and.
Okay. Just trying to figure out like action items so we can move this forward. Does someone want to like take up the challenge of defining those for our next meeting?
So one, maybe if we break it down, it'll be easier. It's like, what tests would we run to say, yes, my cloud provider meets the requirements of the system? It gets dangerously close to this idea of, what are they called? Profiles or badges in conformance, where in addition to conformance, there are extra characteristics you get if you use this implementation, like infinite scaling or some stuff like that. The first couple of passes at, what were they? The profiles were like alpha and beta, but those seemed like wonky things to shove into that idea where you're saying that beta is a extra special feature on top of conformant Kubernetes, and that seems like it was more a claim on quality and doneness of the API rather than a feature. So
Stunted and scalable.
Yeah, but no, I mean,
No one wants to be stunted.
Like, secure multi-tenant Kubernetes. I was like, well, it was actually a restriction, but it sounded like an enhancement, and it gets really touchy to figure out who can put what badge on their product. And so if we can avoid the profiles conversation and just come up with a test suite, I think that would be lovely.
I will certainly, like, I'm very much in favor of this sort of action-based approach there, and I would love to like get a test, e-test running, whatever subset you want to name it, conformance or conformance alpha, with Cloud Controller Manager. Like, the ET suite is a superset of conformance and includes some cloud tests. And
Yeah, so maybe this is the time to have the, I don't know, cloud provider badge.
well, we don't. You can have your badge discussion separately, as far as I'm concerned.
Good.
But like we can get the ED test passing, and then you can badge it or not badge it as appropriate.
That sounds great.
But the
I
EDE
don't
tests,
know, that-
like when we have GCP cloud provider extracted, the same EDE test should work identically to as it works in tree. So that to me feels like an easy test.
Yeah, like a per provider kind of feature or enhancement issue, like that seems good to me. And I really like the approach of not treating the interface as like, alpha, beta, whatever, and just making changes carefully as we go forward.
Yeah, I am interested in these tests because I want to know when ours is the only one that doesn't go the way the herd is going and not have to scramble later. So I see the clear benefit of adding some tests to understand where the implementations deviate. And I think if we can focus on that benefit and just make it useful, then we don't have to focus on it.
So I was kind of pushing for the per provider enhancement because the tests are going to be on a per provider basis. Like, I'm not sure we can have tests that are like provider neutral for this feature.
I think you can because it is an interface, and so the providers are conforming to the interface, which means that the tests will call out. You can call out to the individual cloud provider. You should be able to run the same test against all of the cloud providers and expect particular behavior out of that.
I'm going to disagree, and I'm going to disagree in very isolated cases, but I know of ones like the cert push, which, as far as I can tell, what it does is it creates you give it a certificate, and it finds a way to push it into the environment variable on a node. And I think the keys that it shows up under, et cetera, are very cloud provider specific. That's the only one I can think of that's like that, but I can't swear there aren't others.
Right. I mean, the tests, yeah, right. And there are going to be places where behavior deviates, but in places where we want behavior to be consistent, it seems like, if you say you wanted to, create n nodes, for example, that was the expected behavior. It doesn't matter what the naming of those nodes are. It's the count that matters, so that the tests are inherently going to be limited, but, it's a way to, where we can identify where behavior should be consistent. And, and it's going to be very lowest common denominator in the tests, but it's better than nothing.
And at least it's clear what isn't the same by looking at the tests. And even the omission is signal for something.
I think, that's true, but in fact, I think the signal should actually be in the interface itself. I think the interface should make it very clear for, as I said, for anyone who needs to use the cloud provider interface, like the service route controller owner, which interfaces they can rely on being consistent across cloud providers and which are really, use at your own risk.
Right, but you can enforce that. You can enforce it in the interface, but you can enforce it across. You can check for it across the testing too.
Well, yeah, right. In fact, I think they have to go hand in hand. We set it on the interface, and then we test according to what the interface says.
Right. If an interface isn't implemented, there should be a consistent error message that everybody sends back, for example.
Yeah.
That would be fantastic state to get to. Yeah. I think.
There's a very, it used to be the case at least that UDP load balancers are not implemented on AWS. And I think it just silently, or like it just fails to create a load balancer and like puts an event in there, but it isn't really like, it's certainly one that would be great to handle consistently. And that one I know of as a difference. It's not exposed at the interface level very obviously. And I think our tests just skip over it. They check if cloud provider is AWS.
Yeah, and same thing with the load balancer names initiative that we're doing, where we want to give providers the option to use a better name than like 32 random characters. And so like the interface we may think is stable in the behavior that it provides, but providers may want to hold back on going alpha or beta because they want to fix things that don't kind of surface up to that interface. So like if we're bubbling things down to the providers, like we should just set the expectation from the providers to actually test the interface and assume that it's working the way they want it to. I just think it's going to be hard to do like a catch-all and coordinate everyone on a common thing there.
So I think the catch-all may be hard for everything, but I think that we should try for the core pieces that are widely used. We should try to get something a la conformance test on them. Even if it is you run your own E2E conformance test, but this is the dictated behavior so that anyone using that particular method can rely on the behavior.
And do you think we should express those tests directly against the cloud provider interface, or do you think we should express it against the Kubernetes API?
I mean, it would have to be a cloud provider interface, right?
Yeah, I'm with Andrew on this one. I think if we really want to make that bulletproof, it needs to be done at the cloud provider level.
I think that's right. And I think the testing of the Kubernetes API, that's where the conformance test or not discussion happens, is that a profile or a badge or something else that a user of the API can do X, Y, or Z. This is more giving ourselves some signal guarantee that we're behaving consistently across this group. Is that the right way to characterize that? You guys agree?
Yeah, and I guess what I was trying to say is like the interface by definition does that, because you can't compile your code without conforming to the interface, and the interface should, its signature itself should just force that. But obviously things are more complicated than that, and every provider has like their little niches or little issues that kind of can diverge away from that expectation, and which is why I think like ultimately if we just force, or if we just kind of hand that responsibility to each provider to kind of define alpha, beta in their own terms, I think that's a reasonable approach, but that's just my take on it.
I'm almost there. I need to think about it a little bit. I think I see what you're saying now.
At the same time, I sort of like someone's suggestion for like, if we have a create 3 nodes, an interface that is basically create 3 nodes, I would love to just see a generic test that is call the cloud provider interface and create 3 nodes, and then verify 3 nodes were created. That just seems like a good common test that we can just say, look, if that test exists, then we have faith that the interface has been implemented correctly.
Okay, so it seems like what we're all wanting is more of just like a cloud provider conformance test suite. And if we have that, then we can
more test coverage on cloud provider.
Yes.
Avoid the magic word.
Yeah.
Or if that's a serious term, maybe validation. I don't.
Yeah, conformance, it has a different, conformance is a little bit different connotation, just because it refers more to the public facing APIs and not the internal Go APIs.
However, Node has node conformance tests, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So I wonder if there's sort of a pattern we can repeat. Just
yeah, quite possibly. But
I'll look into that and see for next time.
So it sounds to me like the actions are, we're not going to say GA for 113 or 114. We're going to push to better define behavior of the interface through tests. And were there any other action items that we needed there?
So in fact, since you bring up 114, do we want to actually try and have an in-person planning meeting at some point during Seattle?
Yeah.
I mean, it just seems like a perfect timing for that.
Yeah, I think we have 2 sessions, right? We have an intro session and a deep dive session. I think that's correct.
Yeah, maybe let's use the deep dive session to plan deeply. How do we get to done in 114 or milestone 1 or GA or whatever we call it?
Yeah.
And we should use the time between now and then to at least populate agendas, come up with what the questions are, do some initial legwork so that that's productive and not brainstorming.
Right.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think we can start on the test though, because I think regardless, we're going to want those.
Yeah. And Q4, it's so short this quarter. It's the year's almost over anyway. So at least we will be removing our 1 month of planning, 1 month of doing, 1 month of code freeze and integration, and reducing the overhead of these releases. So we should get more done overall.
Okay. All right. So are we in a good spot? Should we move on the agenda now?
I think so.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Next on the agenda is
it the extraction?
Yeah, an update on the cloud provider extraction effort.
Yeah. So last week I created an issue which pretty much tracks all the dependencies we have against Kubernetes/Kubernetes. And so Walter, just correct me if I'm wrong, but the approach we're taking here is we need to move everything that is a cloud provider into staging. That way we have a way to like sync staging repos into the actual external repos while being able to still build providers into Kube Controller Manager in Tree. And to do the staging migration, we need to remove all the dependencies in the provider's code against Kubernetes/Kubernetes. And so we have a tracking issue with all the dependencies that we are currently trying to remove. So Walter, feel free to kind of add in whatever else.
Yeah, no, I think that's it. I mean, I think even efforts where we're trying to get a little ahead of the game on the individual repos, where we're sort of vendoring in things we theoretically shouldn't, the goal here is to get to a place where all of our repos are correctly depending on things that have been made public. And the idea is partly to make sure that we're only depending on things that are meant to be public, and also by making sure that the things we depend on are marked as public. We get a better ability to observe backward compatible changes, get consideration for is it safe to make sweeping changes, or do those changes need to be more considered, right? Things that are in K8s, but not in staging, theoretically someone should be able to make a change everything that's in K8s that depends on it, and boom, you're done, and you're assured you haven't broken anyone. In staging, if you make a change to something public that's marked as then that there are potentially things in outside repos that may change. So you should be spending more time, you should be spending more in release notes, etc. And so I think it is just a much better place to be if we only depend on things that are in staging. And then, yes, we also get the advantage of all the tooling that Chow and Deeds put in for syncing, etc.
Okay. Yeah, the one thing that OpenStack has done with a little bit of work on this is there's entry standalone, entry Cinder code, which it's all pre-CSI, and there's some dependencies that exist on that. And we're looking at wrapping those in an interface that the external provider can plug into. And this is another way so that Kubernetes can vendor in that external code until all of the people who depend on that interface can vendor in the external code, and we can start pulling that code out in a way that won't disrupt users. So I put in the KEP that we have for that, and that links to a pull request that Dims has been working on. So that's just if you have similar patterns, we're a little bit unique because we have our weird storage driver and all that stuff. Something that you might want to take a look at.
Yeah, and definitely we'll take a look. And there's also a few packages that are unassigned. So if anyone wants to take the fun task of removing dependencies there, then please take them. I think one important thing to note is that we haven't really defined a strategy on how to remove those dependencies. We've been kind of just like, it's kind of just been like take a package and just wing it and see if someone will kind of approve the PR. And a common pattern that I'm seeing, at least, is that there's a Kubernetes/utils repo, which is just like a repo where people dump general like common packages. And so, yeah, what I've been seeing is like we take some utils package that is shared across the providers, but also other places in Kubernetes, and we're kind of just merging them into utils. And then we have to update the vendor in Kubernetes/Kubernetes, and then pretty much just update all the imports from all the providers and wherever else that package is used. And so we're going to be there's going to be a bit of pushback from like SIG Arc and whoever is owners of those common packages. And so that might slow us down a little bit.
Every utils package I've ever interacted with is just the junk in the trunk place, which always becomes a problem at some point. So.
Oh yeah.
Never.
So also, I know this got mentioned on the Slack channel, and we talked about it in the actual sort of working group. Not that I'm trying to touch a sore point, but I think it's worth mentioning. When a couple of the people on my team ran a bit of an experiment trying to yank out all the cloud provider code that wasn't ours and all the things that were only being pulled in for that cloud or for those cloud providers. And what we found is we could drop between 1/4 and 1/3 of a million lines of code out of out of the Kubernetes project. This amounted to, I think, a 30 megabyte drop in the Kube API server binary size and a 25 megabyte drop in the Kube controller manager size.
Nice.
So, I mean, if you guys are wondering what sort of benefits we'll get to when we finally get this done, this is basically, I think, a lower bound on the sort of improvements that we can expect.
Love deleting code. It's the greatest thing ever. Double points for deleting code.
Yeah.
That's excellent.
Nice. But yeah, I think that's it for the extraction update.
Okay.
However, that's a really good segue into the topic I added to the agenda late, which is that there's a thread going around about LTS working group, and it gets very much into the kernel versus distro discussion. How and where do we build things? What are the artifacts? How are they discoverable? I think our work on how to make consistent directory structures and making things consistent is very much aligned with parts of this discussion. And I just want to make sure that folks in this group are aware of that discussion. And if you have opinions, to jump in to either to that working group or pay attention to the SIG release channel on that.
Wait, so is there like a mailing list thread or something where this is talked
I
about?
linked to it. So I linked to both the slides.
Okay.
Some background context is there. And then I also linked to the discussion that went to Kubernetes Dev about the formation of that working group.
Okay.
And I know everyone else is overwhelmed with incoming messages and it's hard to figure out what's important all the time. So I wanted to be really clear and bring it up here as well, because I think there are implications. And I think we have input into that discussion that might be useful.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing.
Okay. Any other questions on that topic? Is there any other additional things that folks wanted to talk about during this time?
I spoke to Andrew Chen, who was leading the docs effort, and he said he wasn't anymore, or there was like a change in. Is there any updates on that? Or any of the docs stuff?
No. I mean, that's kind of fallen into my wheelhouse here, and I haven't updated anything on it yet. I haven't missed the SIG docs meeting. I think it was today or yesterday. So,
okay.
No strong updates there.
Okay. So,
I don't have an update if that was on the who replaces him on writing the docs for Google either, but I will follow up on that one.
Okay. But from our end, we should just keep following I guess like kept 19 on each provider writing docs for their own thing, and then later we'll figure out how to put everything together.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the tricky part became how to put things together and expose it to end users, and I actually don't know how that has evolved, but
that might be a useful thing to do. To maybe the next step right now is to do a survey of the existing docs out there to see where there are similarities and differences, and try to maybe start communicating how we can pull those threads together. And I can volunteer to do that.
Awesome.
thanks. And then I think if a small subset of the folks here will be in Shanghai. We also have intro and deep dive sessions set aside there. One thing I want to talk about, if there is quorum, is about this: how do we build what we intend to build, and what is the output of the Kubernetes build and release process? Making a vanilla Kubernetes release like a vanilla Android release or similar. And so it'll be a discussion. No binding decisions will be made because I don't think there will be enough people there, but just raising awareness.
Yeah, I won't be making that. The OpenStack Summit is the same week in Berlin, so I'll be there. But
all right.
Who's going to be in at KubeCon China?
I'll be there.
I'll be there. I think Fabio's not on this call, but I think he's planning to be there as well.
Yeah. Cool.
Excellent. We'll see some folks.
Alrighty, yeah. Maybe if you're going to be there, if you maybe we can add your name to the Google Docs so we can get an idea of who's going to be showing up and do a little bit of planning beforehand. But if that's everything, I don't have anything else to add to the agenda. Is there any other items?
No.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We'll see you all soon.
Thanks, Chris.
Bye.